Tonight, we're not here to fix anything, not to understand everything, not to become someone better before you're allowed to rest. This is a quiet space where we gently let go and return to inner peace through soft Zen stories inspired by the Buddha, shared slowly so your mind can soften and your body can rest. Maybe today asked a little too much from you. Too many thoughts, too many worries, too many small things you tried to hold together. And maybe, just for this moment, you're ready to set them down. Here, you don't need to improve yourself. You don't need to solve tomorrow. You are already enough simply by being here, breathing quietly. Just for a moment. Where are you listening from tonight? Wherever you are, I'm grateful you're here, sharing this quiet space. Let your breath slow as if it remembers the way home. Let your shoulders soften like they no longer need to carry the world. Tonight, we'll listen to a simple story. A story from ordinary life, carrying a small thread of Zen and Buddhist wisdom. Not to give you more to think about, but to help you loosen your grip. Because suffering rarely ends by force. It softens when we stop holding it so tightly. There's nothing to rush, nothing to achieve, only a gentle drifting into rest, into stillness. Whether you stay awake or slowly fall asleep, this moment is already enough. And now, we begin tonight's journey with these Zen stories. There are moments when anger arrives quietly, not as an explosion, but as a tightening. The jaw sets, the shoulders lift, the mind begins to gather evidence. It doesn't feel dramatic, it feels justified. And that's what makes it hard to notice. It happened after a meeting that ran a little longer than planned. A comment was made, not loud, not cruel on the surface, just sharp enough to land, sharp enough to replay itself on the drive home. The car was parked in the company lot, engine already off, but the body hadn't caught up yet. The steering wheel was still warm from both hands gripping it too tightly. Outside the building, lights hummed. Somewhere far away, another car door closed. The world had moved on. Inside the car, the moment was still stuck. The comment kept looping. The tone, the timing, the way it had landed in front of others. The mind began filling in the rest. They meant that. They always do this. They don't respect me. Anger likes to pretend it's clear-sighted. It says I see exactly what happened. But often it's working with very little information and a very loud story. A coffee cup sat in the holder between the seats. The lid clicked softly as it was twisted back and forth, back and forth. The motion was automatic. Something the hands did when the mind didn't know where else to go. It felt obvious who was wrong. It felt obvious who had crossed a line. And it felt necessary to hold on to that feeling, as if letting it go would mean admitting something painful, or worse, letting someone get away with it. But there was a small pause. Not a decision, just a pause. In that pause, a strange image surfaced. Not related to work, not related to the meeting. Just an image of someone watching a musician play without being able to hear the music. Watching the movement, the expressions, the timing of the hands, and deciding based on that alone what the music must be. It's easy to judge a performance when you can't hear the sound. The thought wasn't comforting. It was unsettling. Because it suggested something uncomfortable, maybe the picture being judged wasn't complete. Maybe the mind was reacting to movement without sound, action without context, words without the story behind them. The anger didn't disappear. It stayed, warm and tight, but it shifted slightly. From "they're wrong" to "I might not be hearing the whole thing." That shift didn't feel noble. It felt irritating. Part of the mind wanted to snap back into certainty. Certainty feels safer than ambiguity. Certainty lets anger stretch its legs and settle in. But ambiguity has a way of loosening things. The parking lot light flickered once, then steadied. The coffee lid clicked again. A breath went in a little deeper than before. Another went out a little slower, not intentionally, just because the body does that when it senses there might be less danger than it thought. Anger often assumes intent. It assumes meaning. It assumes knowledge. It fills in gaps quickly and confidently. And when it does, it usually puts the heaviest weight on the worst explanation. But intent lives in a place we don't have access to. It lives in histories we don't know, pressures we don't see, worries that don't announce themselves. It doesn't mean the comment was fine. It doesn't mean it didn't hurt. It just means the story built around it might be louder than the facts. There was a moment of imagining the other person's day. Not in detail. Not as an excuse. Just a brief acknowledgement that there was a day. Emails, deadlines, their own internal weather. A song playing in their head that no one else could hear. That thought didn't soften everything, but it interrupted the momentum. Anger needs momentum. It needs agreement. It needs repetition. When it doesn't get those, it starts to lose its grip. The hand stopped twisting the coffee lid. It rested there instead. The chest still felt tight, but not as locked. The mind still had opinions, but they were less sharp, less eager to attack. It became possible, just possible, to see that reacting fully right now would be like judging a piece of music while wearing earplugs. Confident, loud, and probably wrong in important ways. Nothing was resolved in that car. No forgiveness was granted. No insight was crowned as wisdom. There was only a small restraint, a choice not to throw the hot coal immediately. The engine was still off. The night was still early. And for the first time since the meeting ended, the anger wasn't being fed. It was just there, waiting, unsure if it would be picked up again. The anger didn't leave that night. It rarely does just because it's been noticed. Instead, it changed shape. It became quieter, more patient. The kind of anger that waits until later, until the house is dark and the mind has room to wander. At-home shoes were kicked off near the door. The kitchen lights stayed off. Only the soft glow from a lamp in the living room filled the space. Everything felt normal. almost calm. And that's usually when the mind decides it's safe to continue. The comment returned, but this time with edits. New wording, better comebacks. A version of the conversation where things were said clearly, firmly, perfectly. Where respect was demanded and received. Anger likes to rehearse. It believes that if it can get the script right, the pain will disappear. Or at least feel justified. A phone sat face down on the coffee table. It would be easy to pick it up, to send a message, to clarify, to correct, to make sure the other person understood exactly how it felt. The urge felt clean, responsible even. This isn't anger, the mind whispered. This is standing up for yourself. But there was that earlier image again, the person watching music without sound, judging tempo without hearing rhythm, deciding meaning from movement alone. What if this response too was being written without hearing the full song? That question didn't stop the urge. It just slowed it. Enough to notice something else underneath the anger. Not rage. Not hatred. Something more fragile. Embarrassment. A sense of being exposed. The old ache of wanting to be taken seriously. Anger often arrives as protection. It steps in front of softer feelings and speaks loudly so they don't have to. The phone stayed on the table. Not because of discipline, because the body felt tired of holding a shield all the time. A glass of water was poured at the sink. The sound was steady, ordinary. The kind of sound that doesn't demand attention. The glass was fuller than intended. Water crept toward the edge and spilled slightly onto the counter. It wasn't dramatic. Just enough to notice. The towel was grabbed without irritation. The spill wiped up. No commentary, no blame, no lingering. It was such a small thing. But it landed. Problems don't always need to be thrown away. Some things are cleaned, quietly, without punishment. The mind returned to the moment in the meeting, the tone, the timing. And then for the first time, another possibility was allowed to exist alongside the original story. Not replacing it, just sitting next to it. What if that comment wasn't aimed? What if it wasn't about me? What if it came from stress, not intent? These questions didn't excuse the impact. They didn't erase the sting. But they loosened the grip of certainty. And certainty is what turns anger into a prison. Forgiveness is often misunderstood. It's imagined as something generous, something done for another person, a gift, a moral achievement. But more often, forgiveness begins as a practical decision. A refusal to keep replaying the same scene in the same tone. A choice to stop letting the nervous system stay on high alert for something that already passed. The anger was still there, but it was no longer being sharpened. The mind tried once more to rehearse the conversation. This time it didn't have as much energy. The lines sounded forced, overworked, like a joke told too many times. The body shifted on the couch. A deeper breath came and went. Not because it was instructed to, because there was room for it now. It became clear that holding on to the anger wasn't keeping anyone accountable. It was just keeping the moment alive, over and over, long after it needed to be. And maybe that's what forgiveness actually is. Not saying what you did was fine, not pretending it didn't hurt, but deciding that the moment doesn't get unlimited access to your nights. The thought of responding tomorrow after sleep, after space, felt different than responding now. Less charged, less urgent, more grounded. That difference mattered. The lamp was turned off. The room darkened. The house made its small, settling sounds. Pipes, walls, the quiet proof that time was moving forward, whether the mind cooperated or not. Anger can be like listening to only the loudest instrument in a song and assuming that's all there is. Forgiveness doesn't require loving the music. It only asks that you admit there might be more playing than you can hear right now. Lying there, nothing was resolved. No apologies imagined, no outcomes guaranteed. Just a body that no longer needed to stay clenched around a single note. The anger wasn't gone, but it wasn't in charge. And for tonight, that was enough. Some days Lila brings home feelings that aren't really hers. Not because anyone asks her to carry them, but because she knows how to listen. How to stay with someone in a hard moment. And when you stay long enough, other people's emotions can cling to you, the way smoke clings to clothes. You don't notice right away. But at night, when everything goes quiet, you realize you're still carrying them. Lila is 55, a hospice volunteer. Her work isn't loud. There are no dramatic scenes, just quiet rooms, soft lighting, and small conversations, sometimes nothing more than presence. That afternoon, she stayed later than usual. An elderly patient held her hand a little longer, as if the warmth of another hand was enough to ease the loneliness. When Lila left, she could still feel that grip in the palm of her hand. When she gets home, she doesn't turn on the main lights. She lets the glow from the kitchen and hallway be enough. The house is still a faint scent of soap lingering from the bathroom. Lila sets her bag down, takes off her coat, and walks straight into the bathroom out of habit. Not because she's dirty, but because she needs to wash. She turns on the faucet. The water runs clear and steady, making a familiar sound she's always found calming. Lila places her hands under the stream, letting the water run between her fingers. The warmth spreads, then cools. As if the water is reminding her body that she's home, now that she's allowed to be herself again. A small bar of soap sits by the sink. Lila picks it up and rubs it gently. White foam forms. She watches the bubbles and suddenly thinks of something she's heard many times in hospice. Everything passes. People say it in different ways. Some with calm voices, some through tears. But it's always true in a way no one can really argue with. Lila washes her hands slowly. Not the quick, practical kind of washing. She does it like a small ritual, palm to palm, the backs of her hands, each finger. The foam covers her skin, then gets carried away by the water. As she watches it disappear, she becomes aware of the feeling that's been clinging to her all day, sadness. Not sadness from her own life. Sadness from seeing how fragile people are. From hearing a voice grow weaker. From the kind of silence in a room where you can hear someone breathing. She doesn't try to push the sadness away. She doesn't try to hold on to it, to honor it either. She just looks at it the way she looks at the soap bubbles present, then gone. The water doesn't judge the foam. It simply passes through, doing what it's meant to do. Lila uses her finger to trace a small letter on the thin layer of water pooled in her palm. The shape disappears before it's fully formed. She tries again a little faster. Still gone. No mark, no trace. As if the water is saying, "It's okay. It's already passed." She stands there listening to the sound of the water. In that steady rhythm, she realizes something. Many of her feelings are like this too. They arrive strong or soft, depending on the day, but their nature is to move on. It's only when she tries to carve them in by replaying them in her mind, by blaming herself, by telling the story over and over, that they stay like ink. When she lets them move through like water, they don't need to remain. Lila turns off the faucet. The sudden quiet makes the room feel even calmer. But the quiet isn't empty. It feels like a blank space, one that doesn't ask her to carry anything more. She dries her hands with a soft towel. The fabric absorbs the water warm against her skin. Lila looks at herself in the mirror. Her face hasn't changed. Just her eyes look a little tired. She touches her cheek gently, a reminder that she needs care too. Not only the people she listens to. If you're listening and you're carrying the weight of an entire day, worry, sadness, irritation, guilt, tension tonight, you don't need to keep those feelings to prove that you are present. You can let them pass, like words written on water. Here for a moment, then gone. Lila leaves the bathroom and walks slowly toward the bedroom. The house remains quiet, but inside her something feels lighter, like part of the day has finally been washed away. Lila turns off the bathroom light, leaving the hallway in a very soft glow. The house now feels like a still lake after the wind has passed. Nothing has been taken away. Only the small ripples have faded. She walks slowly, not because she's tired, but because there's no need to move any faster. In the bedroom, she doesn't turn on the main light. She lets a thin line of light slip through the curtain, just enough to see that everything familiar is still there. The bed, the pillows, the chair holding her jacket. Nothing asks for her attention. Lila sits on the edge of the bed and rests her hands on her thighs. Her skin feels dry, warm, no lingering slickness from soap or water. Clean, but not empty. She lies down. The mattress supports her body in a gentle way, as if it's known her rhythm for a long time. Lila pulls the blanket up to her chest. No adjusting, no searching for the perfect position. She just lets her weight be held. And in that moment, she realizes something simple. She doesn't need to keep any feeling to prove that today mattered. Images from the afternoon drift by very lightly. A quiet room, a warm hand, a slow voice. They arrive, then pass, leaving no mark, like writing on water, present just long enough to be seen, then gone when they're no longer needed. Lila exhales. The breath leaves her fully, no longer caught in her chest. Between two breaths, there's a very thin space. In that space, there are no roles, no responsibilities, no one who needs care, just a human being at rest. If there's a feeling that still lingers, sadness, tenderness, or fatigue, Lila doesn't push it away. She lets it be there like a leaf floating on the surface of water. No need to pick it up, no need to push it under. Just letting the water carry it away in its own rhythm. She remembers a line she heard long ago, but only truly understands tonight emotions are not places to live. They are places to pass through. When you allow them to pass, they don't need to stay any longer than necessary. Lila's eyelids grow heavy, not because she's trying to sleep, simply because her body has been allowed to stop. In that soft darkness, the boundary between thoughts and sensations fades. Everything blends together, then thins out like ink dissolving in water. If you're listening and you feel yourself growing lighter too, you can let that happen. There's no need to stay alert. No need to follow every word. You're not missing anything. Emotions don't need to be remembered to have value. They've done their work simply by being felt. And if you fall asleep at some point, that's completely natural. Water doesn't keep the shape of letters. And the night doesn't hold on to what you don't need to carry into sleep. Just let everything drift. No marks, no effort. Listen for a little while, and then let the night carry away everything that's already done. There was an extra chair pulled up to the kitchen island, and no one was sitting in it. It hadn't been there earlier in the day. Earlier, the space was tight, crowded with bags, mail, a half-empty water bottle, a laptop pushed to one side. Everything had a place, and that place was usually right where the hands could reach it. Nothing was meant to rest. Everything was meant to be ready. Now, it was late. The overhead light was off, leaving only the small yellow lamp above the sink. The dishwasher hummed in its steady, forgettable way, like a sound the house made when it was allowed to take care of itself. Outside, a car passed once, then the street went quiet again. The chair was plain, wooden, nothing special. It had been pulled over almost without thinking, just slid across the floor until it faced the island. The person standing there didn't sit down right away. They leaned against the counter instead, arms crossed, shoulders lifted a little higher than necessary. All day, there had been things to hold. A meeting that needed preparation, a message that couldn't be ignored, a problem that wasn't technically theirs, but somehow still ended up in their hands. Even dinner had been eaten quickly, standing up fork resting on the edge of the sink between bites. There was always a sense that if they stopped moving, something might fall apart. The body remembered that feeling now, even though the day was technically over. The shoulders stayed tight. The jaw didn't quite unclench. The mind kept scanning like it was still on duty, waiting for the next thing that might need attention. The empty chair didn't ask for anything. It just stayed where it was. For a moment, the person noticed an odd irritation rise up. The chair felt unnecessary, in the way, like a pause that hadn't been earned yet. There was still tomorrow to think about, still loose ends, still that quiet pressure to be useful, to prove something even to an empty room. They reached for a mug and filled it with water, then set it down on the island without drinking. The dishwasher hummed. A soft click came from somewhere inside it, a small mechanical decision being made without any help. There was a memory, faint but persistent, of being younger and being told to wait, to stand back, to make room. Someone else needed the seat more. Someone else mattered more in that moment. It wasn't said cruelly. It didn't have to be. It was just the way things were arranged. Over time, standing became normal, hovering, being ready, being available. The chair scraped softly as it was pulled back a few inches. The sound was louder than expected in the quiet kitchen. The person paused, hands still on the top rail, as if surprised by their own movement. They sat down slowly. At first it felt wrong, too exposed, like sitting meant admitting something they weren't sure they were allowed to admit yet. The back of the chair pressed gently between the shoulder blades. The feet found the floor. The body registered contact, weight, support. Nothing dramatic happened. The room didn't change. The to-do list didn't disappear. Tomorrow didn't cancel itself. But something inside the chest loosened just enough to be noticeable. It's strange how unfamiliar rest can feel when you haven't practiced it in a while. Not the kind of rest that comes from collapsing at the end of the day, but the kind that comes from choosing to stop before you're forced to. The kind that says, just for now, this is enough. The person noticed how the island looked from this angle, how the edge was worn smooth in one spot, how a small crumb had been missed during cleaning. Ordinary details suddenly visible when the body wasn't leaning forward anymore. They rested their hands on their thighs. The fingers twitched once, like they were checking whether they were allowed to be empty. The mind tried out of habit to fill the space. You should answer that email. You forgot to follow up. You could be doing more right now. The thoughts arrived the way they always did, lined up and confident, like they belonged there. But tonight they didn't land quite as hard. It was as if the chair absorbed some of the impact, as if having a place to sit gave the body permission not to obey every instruction immediately. There is a quiet kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from doing too much, but from never letting yourself arrive anywhere. From always being slightly ahead of the moment you're in, reaching for the next thing before this one is even settled. The person noticed their breathing, not in a deliberate way, just noticed that it had slowed. The inhale wasn't rushed. The exhale went a little longer than expected, like the body was surprised it had the time. The empty chair across from them stayed empty. It didn't accuse, it didn't compare. It didn't ask them to earn the right to be there. It simply marked a space where effort wasn't required. For the first time that evening, the person let their shoulders drop fully. Not all at once, just a fraction, enough to feel the difference. Enough to realize how high they'd been holding them all day without noticing. They stayed there longer than they meant to. Not because they were trying to heal anything. Not because they were making a point. Just because for once, nothing was pulling them away. And somewhere in that quiet kitchen with the dishwasher humming and the extra chair holding its place, a small truth settled in. Without words, a maybe rest isn't something you get after everything is done. Maybe it's something you're allowed to take, even when the world keeps going. They didn't stay seated the whole time. After a while, they stood up again, almost out of habit. Rinsed the mug in the sink, wiped a small spill on the counter. The body still knew its routines, still wanted to be useful, still wanted to justify its presence by doing something that looked productive. But when they were done, they didn't rush away. They pulled the chair back again. This time the movement felt less strange, less like stealing time, more like returning to a place that had been there all along. Sitting down didn't feel dramatic anymore. It felt normal, which surprised them. The dishwasher clicked and shifted into a new cycle. A deeper, slower hum filled the kitchen, like the house had decided to settle for the night. The lamp over the sink cast a soft shadow on the wall, uneven and imperfect. Nothing in the room looked curated or impressive. It just looked lived in. From this stillness, another thought surfaced. Not sharp, not demanding, just quiet and persistent. What if I don't have to earn my place here? The idea felt unfamiliar, almost irresponsible. Somewhere along the way, rest had become something that had to be justified. You rest after you finish. You sit once you've proven your value. You stop only when there's nothing left that could possibly need you. But there was always something left. The person thought about how often they'd made space for others without hesitation. Pulled out chairs, adjusted schedules, listened longer than they had energy for, said yes even when their body was already tired. It wasn't resentment they felt now, just a soft recognition of a pattern that had been running quietly for years. They had learned to be the one who stands by, stands in, stands ready. And over time, standing became part of how they measured their worth. If they were needed, they mattered. If they were useful, they belonged. Sitting down felt like disappearing. The empty chair across from them broke that spell a little. It was still there, still unoccupied, still unnecessary in the most ordinary way. And yet it held something important, the idea that space doesn't have to be taken from someone else to exist, that making room for yourself doesn't mean pushing anyone out. The person rested their elbows lightly on the island. The cool surface grounded them. They noticed how the day had finally reached their hands and feet. How tiredness, when allowed to arrive, felt different from exhaustion. Softer, more honest. There's a difference between being worn down and being allowed to stop. They had mistaken one for the other for a long time. The mind tried again to fill the quiet. You could be better than this. You should be further along. Other people don't need this much rest. The thoughts came, but now they were quieter, less convincing, like echoes in a room that had already emptied. The person didn't argue with them, didn't correct them, didn't try to replace them with something more positive. They just let the thoughts pass through the way sound passes through a space, without leaving marks on the walls. They stayed seated. The chair held their weight without comment. In that simple support, something shifted. Not in a way that demanded attention, just enough to change the tone of the evening. The pressure to be impressive softened. The need to justify their existence loosened its grip. They didn't suddenly feel confident or healed or whole in some dramatic sense. They just felt present. And present, it turned out, was enough for the night. The value they had been chasing all day wasn't missing. It hadn't been delayed or denied. It had just been quiet, waiting for them to stop running long enough to notice it. Value didn't come from what they completed, or how much they carried, or how little space they took up. It was already there in the body, sitting in the chair, in the breath moving without effort, in the simple fact of being here, even when nothing was being produced. They looked once more at the empty chair across from them and understood it differently now. It wasn't empty because no one deserved it. It was empty because there was finally room. Room to sit without proving anything. Room to rest without explanation. Room to exist without performing. Eventually, they would stand again, turn off the lamp, walk down the hallway. Tomorrow would come as it always did, with its lists and demands and small urgencies. But something would go with them. The memory of that chair, the feel of being supported without conditions, the quiet knowing that their worth hadn't changed based on how much they did. And even when the chair was pushed back under the table, even when the kitchen returned to its usual arrangement, that space would still exist. Not in the room, but inside them. A place they could return to, a place that didn't need to be earned. Some evenings don't feel dramatic. Nothing goes wrong in a loud way. It's just that everything feels a little unsteady. Like the ground isn't doing anything wrong, but you don't quite trust it either. It was one of those evenings. A long day had already ended, but the body hadn't caught up yet. The parking lot behind the building was almost empty, the kind of quiet that comes after people have gone home and the lights stay on anyway. The engine was off. The seat was still warm. Somewhere far away, another car started and then faded into the street. Sitting there, there was a familiar feeling in the chest. Not panic, not exactly worry. More like a constant readiness, as if something might happen and it would be important to be prepared. The mind kept drifting forward. Tomorrow's schedule. A conversation that hadn't happened yet. A small fear that didn't have a clear shape. Nothing urgent, but nothing settled either. After a few minutes, the door opened. Cool air came in, shoes touched the asphalt. The body stretched without thinking about it, shoulders rolling once, twice, as if trying to shake something loose. The night smelled faintly like oil and warm concrete. And then, almost by accident, one foot lifted. It wasn't a decision made with meaning, just a shift of weight while standing beside the car. One foot stayed planted. The other hovered uncertain before settling against the ankle. At first it felt silly. A grown adult standing in a quiet parking lot, balanced on one leg like a kid pretending to be a flamingo. But the body didn't care about looking silly. It immediately got busy. Ankles adjusted, toes spread inside the shoe. A small muscle in the calf woke up and complained. There was a wobble. The lifted foot touched down again, then lifted once more. This time the body stayed up, not perfectly still. There was movement, a tiny sway side to side. The arms shifted slightly away from the body without permission, like they knew their job. The breath changed too. Short at first, then slower, deeper, as if it had been waiting for a reason. Standing there on one leg, something became clear in a quiet way. Balance wasn't about being rigid. The moment the body tried to freeze, everything shook more. It was the small, constant adjustments that kept things upright. A little give, a little response. The mind noticed this, and as minds do, tried to turn it into a thought. This is like life. But that thought didn't land very hard. It wasn't needed. Because right then, balance wasn't an idea. It was a sensation. The ground felt solid under the standing foot. Cool, reliable. It hadn't changed. The fear that had been sitting in the chest earlier didn't disappear, but it stopped being the center of attention. There was more interesting information coming in now. Pressure, muscle, breath. The lifted leg trembled. That tremble felt important. It would have been easy to judge it, to see it as weakness, as proof that something wasn't strong enough. But the tremble wasn't failing. It was communicating. It was the body saying, "I'm working." After a few seconds, the foot came down again, both feet on the ground. A small exhale followed longer than expected. The shoulders dropped. Nothing had been solved. Tomorrow was still tomorrow. The unknown was still unknown. But something had shifted. The body had learned even briefly that it could stay upright without knowing what came next. That stability didn't require certainty. It only required attention to what was actually happening now. The other foot lifted. This time, balance came a little faster. Not because anything magical had changed, but because the body remembered. It remembered that wobbling wasn't danger. It was part of staying up. A breeze moved through the lot. The overhead lights hummed softly. Somewhere a door closed. Standing there, it became obvious how often balance gets confused with control. As if staying steady means locking everything down. As if fear could be managed by gripping harder. But here gripping did the opposite. Tightening made the wobble worse. Soft knees worked better. A relaxed jaw worked better. Letting the breath move without directing it worked better. The lifted leg shook again, then steadied. And for a moment, there was a quiet understanding that didn't need words. The feeling of being unsure didn't mean something was wrong. It just meant the body was alive, responding, adjusting, staying present with what was real instead of what might happen. Eventually, the foot came down. Both feet rested on the ground again. The parking lot hadn't changed. The future hadn't explained itself. But standing there, grounded and simple, it felt clear that balance was not something you achieve once and keep forever. It was something you kept meeting moment by moment, especially when things felt unstable. And that was enough for now. Later that night, the body remembered the parking lot. Not as a clear picture, but as a feeling. A subtle memory of weight shifting, of standing without rushing to correct every small movement. It showed up while brushing teeth, while rinsing the mug in the sink, while standing in the dim light of the living room. with nothing particular to do. The mind, meanwhile, kept doing what it always does. It leaned forward. It brought up questions without answers. What if the next step didn't work out? What if something important slipped? What if the balance that felt possible for a moment didn't last? Fear has a way of talking about the future as if it's already real, as if it has evidence, as if it's being helpful. But standing in the quiet room, it was easier to see that fear wasn't actually responding to what was happening. Nothing was wrong in that moment. The floor was still there. The lights were steady. The body was breathing. So without much ceremony, one foot lifted again. This time it wasn't playful. It wasn't accidental. It was deliberate but not tense. The standing foot pressed into the floor. The other leg bent slightly at the knee. The body swayed just a little. And there it was, again. That familiar instability. The first instinct was to tighten, to brace, to lock the ankle and hold still. But the memory from earlier interrupted that reflex. Tightening didn't help. It never had. So instead, there was a pause. Not a long pause. Just long enough to notice the urge to control. The body softened where it could. The jaw unclenched. The shoulders dropped half an inch. The breath was allowed to arrive and leave without being shaped. The wobble didn't disappear, but it became workable. Standing on one leg like that made something obvious. The body wasn't asking for guarantees. It wasn't demanding a promise that it wouldn't fall. It was simply asking for presence, for attention to the signals coming in right now instead of imagined outcomes. Fear, on the other hand, kept pointing somewhere else. Later. Soon. What if there was nothing wrong with fear being there? It wasn't an enemy. It was just early. Too early to be useful. The lifted leg trembled again, stronger this time. Muscles fired in quick, quiet patterns. The body adjusted without thinking. A tiny lean forward. A micro shift in the hip. Balance appeared not as stillness, but as constant movement. It was impossible to miss the metaphor, but it didn't need to be explained. The body already understood. Nothing stays fixed. Not balance, not fear, not stability. Trying to freeze any of it only creates strain. After a while, the foot came down. The body rested. The feeling lingered. Later, still lying in bed, the mind tried again. It replayed conversations that hadn't happened yet. It outlined possible problems. It built detailed images of things going wrong, all with the same tone of urgency. But now there was another reference point. Instead of arguing with the thoughts, attention shifted downward, to the weight of the body on the mattress, to the contact points, to the quiet fact of being supported without effort. Balance didn't require standing on one leg forever. It only required knowing where the ground was. And the ground was here. Fear talked about the future as if it were a place you had already arrived. But the body knew better. The body only ever stood in one moment at a time. One breath, one shift, one adjustment. That night there was no big realization, no dramatic release, just a gradual loosening of the need to solve anything before resting. The next morning would come whether it was prepared for or not. The future would change shape the moment it arrived. It always did. Standing, sitting, lying down. None of these were permanent positions. They were all temporary arrangements, useful for a while, then replaced by the next one. And maybe that was the quiet lesson hidden in the wobble. Stability was not something to secure in advance. It was something that appeared when attention stayed close enough to respond. Eventually, sleep came. Not because fear had vanished, but because it no longer needed to be managed. It was allowed to exist without being followed. And somewhere in the background, the body remembered how to stand. Not perfectly, not forever, but well enough. Enough to trust the next step when it arrived. Anger doesn't always arrive as fire. Sometimes it comes as a slow burn, quiet, persistent. The kind that sits in the background and colors everything else. That night, it showed up in the shower. The bathroom was small steam already beginning to cloud the mirror. The water came on warm, then hotter. The sound filled the space steady and enclosing like the world had narrowed down to this one narrow channel. The day had been long, not disastrous, just layered. One small frustration stacked on top of another. A tone that felt dismissive, a look that lingered a second too long, a rule applied unfairly. Nothing that would make a good story later, just enough to accumulate. Anger thrives on accumulation. The water hit the shoulders, muscles loosened slightly. And that's when the replay began. It wasn't one moment. It was several, edited together, tightened, sharpened. The mind spoke quickly now, listing injustices, rehearsing arguments that would never be said out loud. They don't care. They always get away with it. Why does this keep happening? The body reacted before any thought finished. Jaw tight, breath shallow. Hands clenched, then unclenched, then clenched again. Hot water is supposed to relax things, but anger can turn even comfort into fuel. There was a faint sting on the skin. At first it was easy to ignore. Just heat, just sensitivity, but it lingered. The shoulders began to feel raw, irritated, like the water was doing more harm than good. The temperature was adjusted down slightly. The sting eased, but didn't disappear right away. That was when the thought surfaced, uninvited, but accurate. This is what it's like. Anger feels like something you pour outward, toward a person, a system, a situation. It feels directed, purposeful, but it doesn't land where you think. Like acid rain, it eats away at the container long before it touches whatever you're aiming at. The anger that had been carried all day hadn't changed anything outside. The people involved were probably already home, already distracted by their own evenings. But inside this small bathroom, the effects were obvious. Tight muscles, shallow breathing, skin irritated by heat that should have felt soothing. The mind resisted the comparison at first. It wanted the anger to be useful, righteous, deserved. If I let this go, nothing will change, it argued. But holding it hadn't changed anything either. The water ran over the back, down the arms, pooling briefly at the elbows before disappearing down the drain. No matter how long it poured, it didn't fill anything. It didn't accumulate. It just passed through. Anger, on the other hand, stayed. There was a memory of a time when anger had been expressed openly. Years ago. A sharp confrontation. Words spoken with clarity and volume. It had felt powerful in the moment. Later, there had been a hollow feeling. The relationship hadn't improved. The situation hadn't resolved. The anger had simply found a new place to sit. The water temperature was turned down again, cooler now. The skin began to calm, the sting faded. The mind slowed just enough to notice something underneath the anger. Fatigue, disappointment, the quiet sadness of feeling unseen. Anger often steps in front of those feelings. It speaks louder, so they don't have to. The shower filled with steam again. The mirror disappeared completely this time. No reflection, no face, just heat and sound. It became clear that the anger wasn't protecting anything anymore. It was corroding. The body leaned slightly into the tile, forehead cool against the wall. A long breath went out heavier than expected. There was no decision to forgive, no vow to be calm. Just the recognition that continuing like this would keep burning the same place over and over. The anger was still there, but it had lost some of its urgency, some of its authority. The water continued to fall, indifferent, neutral. It didn't care about blame or fairness. It just moved where gravity took it. And standing there, it was possible to see that anger, too, could be allowed to move, to pass, not to be poured endlessly into the same container. The sting was gone now. The skin felt normal again. The shower kept running. The shower was turned off, but the heat lingered. Steam hung in the air, slow to leave. Drops of water slid down the tile-thin lines, tracing paths that didn't last very long. A towel was reached for. The fabric felt rough at first, then comforting. The skin underneath was warm, slightly pink, but no longer irritated. It had already begun to settle. That felt important. Anger rarely ends when the moment ends. It looks for somewhere else to go. A new target. A memory. A person who isn't even in the room. Standing there wrapped in a towel, the mind tried again. It brought up the same faces, the same conversations. This time with sharper edges. It wanted direction. It wanted an outlet. The urge was familiar. To send a message, to complain to someone else. To replay the story with better wording, clearer, blame, stronger justification. But something had shifted. The body felt calmer than the thoughts. That mismatch was noticeable. The chest wasn't tight anymore. The shoulders weren't raised. The anger no longer had full access to the nervous system. It was still loud, but it wasn't driving. That's when the metaphor returned clearer now. Acid rain doesn't destroy in one pour. It works slowly, quietly, over time. It weakens structures from the inside long before anything collapses. The anger that had been carried all day hadn't ruined anyone else's evening. It hadn't corrected behavior. It hadn't brought fairness. It had just kept the body tense, the mind restless, the skin raw. A mirror cleared enough to show a blurred reflection. Not sharp, not detailed, just a shape. A person standing there tired. The towel was adjusted, hair was pushed back. A breath came in, then out. Normal, unforced. There was a memory of someone once saying, "If you don't let it out, it'll eat you alive." At the time that had sounded true, responsible even. But maybe letting it out didn't always mean throwing it at someone else. Maybe it meant letting it move through without giving it a permanent home. The anger didn't need to be suppressed. It didn't need to be justified. It just didn't need to be stored. Getting dressed felt slower than usual. Intentional without trying to be. The simple actions, pulling on a shirt, tying the drawstring, brought attention back to the present moment. In the other room, the house was quiet. No notifications, no voices. Just the low hum of the heater clicking on and off. The mind tried once more to revive the anger, but it came back thinner this time. Less convincing, like a story that had already been told too many times. It was easier now to see what had been happening. The anger had felt like armor, like proof of self-respect, like energy. But armor gets heavy when worn too long. Forgiveness didn't arrive as a feeling. It arrived as a decision not to keep corroding from the inside. A choice not to pour more acid into a container that was already showing wear. That didn't mean trusting again. It didn't mean approving what had happened. It just meant choosing a different relationship with the anger itself. The phone stayed where it was. No messages sent, no explanations drafted. Tomorrow could handle tomorrow's responses. Tonight was about stopping the damage. The body moved toward the bedroom. Lights were turned off one by one. Each click felt like a small boundary being set, not against people but against the habit of carrying what wasn't helping. Lying down, the muscles released more fully. The mind still wandered, but without the same heat, without the same urgency. Anger hadn't disappeared. It probably wouldn't. But it no longer felt like something that needed to be poured, defended, or fed. It felt like weather. And weather passes. The room cooled slowly. The last of the steam faded from the bathroom. The skin finished calming itself, doing what it knows how to do when given the chance. Nothing had been solved, but something important had stopped, and that was enough for tonight. The jar wouldn't open. It wasn't a dramatic problem. No urgency, no real consequence. Just a stubborn lid on a glass jar that had been tightened too far too long ago by someone who probably didn't remember doing it. The kind of small resistance that shouldn't matter and yet somehow does. The kitchen was dim lit only by the hood light over the stove. The rest of the apartment stayed in shadow, quiet and settled. Outside the window, the evening had already cooled. The day felt finished, even if the mind hadn't quite accepted that yet. The person wrapped a towel around the lid and twisted. Nothing. Tried again harder this time. Still nothing. The jar stayed perfectly still, as if it had decided this was where the line was drawn. A sigh came out sharper than expected. It wasn't really about the jar. Earlier in the day, there had been a decision that wouldn't land. Not a big life-changing one, just one of those medium-sized choices that somehow feel heavier than they should. Stay where you are or move on. Say yes or say no. Push through or pause. The kind of decision that seems like it should have a clear answer, but doesn't. The mind had been working on it all afternoon, tightening around it the way fingers tightened around the jar. Every angle examined, every possible outcome imagined, every risk highlighted in bright mental ink. By the time evening arrived, the body felt tired in a specific way, the way you get tired from trying to force clarity. The jar was placed on the counter and stared at like it might explain itself if given enough attention. The label was faded, the glass cool to the touch, the contents inside perfectly fine, waiting, indifferent. Another attempt, this time with both hands. The shoulders tensed, the jaw clenched. The lid didn't move. The mind chimed in immediately. See? You're not strong enough. You're doing it wrong. Try harder. So the person did. A firmer grip, more pressure, a quick twist meant to surprise the lid into cooperation. Nothing. The frustration rose fast out of proportion to the situation. It always does when effort meets resistance for too long. The body leaned closer to the counter like proximity might help. Like being nearer to the problem would somehow solve it. The thought arrived without warning. Why is this so hard? And beneath it, another quieter one. Why am I fighting this? The person stopped twisting. The hands stayed on the jar, but the effort drained out of them. The shoulders dropped a fraction. The breath, which had been shallow and tight, found a little more room. There was a memory then unrelated on the surface. A time years ago when someone had said, "Try loosening it first." Not advice for jars exactly. Advice for situations, for conversations, for moments when everything feels locked. At the time, it had sounded too simple, almost dismissive. Now standing in the dim kitchen, it landed differently. The person set the jar down and stepped back. Just one step. Enough to change the angle, enough to break the spell of force. The room felt quieter from there. Acceptance has a reputation for being passive. Like it means giving up or settling or pretending you don't care. But standing there, hands no longer straining, it felt nothing like that. It felt more like honesty, like admitting that pushing wasn't working. The decision from earlier floated back into awareness. The one that had been tightened by fear, by urgency, by the belief that there must be a right answer available immediately. The more the mind had twisted around it, the less it had moved. Maybe the problem wasn't the lock. Maybe the problem was the grip. The person picked the jar up again, this time without the towel. Just bare hands, a lighter hold. Not testing strength, just contact. The glass felt cool, solid, ordinary. Instead of twisting harder, the person did something else. They loosened the grip slightly, not letting go, just easing. Then twisted gently. The lid shifted. Just a millimeter. Almost nothing. But enough. A small laugh escaped, surprised and quiet. Not because the jar was open, it wasn't yet, but because the resistance had changed the moment the force did. The lid turned again, easier this time. And then it came off completely without drama, without effort, as if it had never been stuck at all. The contents inside smelled fine, normal, unthreatening. The jar had not been guarding anything dangerous. It had just been closed. The person stood there for a moment longer than necessary, lid in one hand, jar in the other. The realization didn't rush in. It didn't need to. Some locks don't respond to pressure. Some doors open when you stop trying to break them down. The decision from earlier hadn't resolved itself yet. Nothing had been solved, but something had softened. The urgency had loosened its hold. The body no longer felt like it was wrestling the evening. The jar went back on the counter, open now, doing nothing special. The kitchen light hummed quietly. The night continued. And somewhere in that ordinary scene, a new understanding settled in, not as a lesson, but as a possibility. Acceptance wasn't the end of movement. It was the key that allowed movement to happen. The jar stayed open on the counter, quietly unremarkable. No glow of success, no sense of victory. Just an open jar doing what open jars do. The moment had passed, and yet it lingered in the body like a soft echo. The person rinsed the lid and set it in the drying rack. The sound of water against metal was gentle, almost meditative. The hands moved slower now, not because there was nothing to do, but because there was no rush to finish. The kitchen didn't ask for speed. The night didn't ask for answers. It was easier to breathe this way. The decision from earlier returned again, as it had all evening. But it arrived differently this time. Less demanding, less sharp around the edges. It no longer felt like a locked door that had to be forced open immediately. It felt more like a room that could be entered later. There is a strange relief in admitting you don't know yet. Not the relief of giving up, but the relief of honesty. The kind that lets your shoulders drop without explanation. The kind that allows uncertainty to exist without turning it into a problem that needs fixing. The mind, of course, tried to reassert itself. It said, you still need to decide. It said you can't avoid this forever. And it was right. But it was missing something important. Avoidance and acceptance are not the same thing. Avoidance tightens. Acceptance softens. Avoidance turns away. Acceptance stays. Standing there in the quiet kitchen, it was clear which one had been happening earlier. The constant thinking, the rehearsing, the twisting that hadn't been engagement. It had been resistance disguised as effort. The person leaned back against the counter, cool tile pressing through the thin fabric of a shirt. The sensation anchored the body to the present. Not the future, not the outcome, just here. Sometimes the mind believes that if it can just solve everything, now rest will be allowed later. But rest doesn't come as a reward. It comes as a condition. It arrives when the nervous system feels safe enough to stand down. Acceptance was doing that now. Not as a philosophy, not as a rule, just as a lived moment of not fighting what was already here. The person thought again of the jar. How the lid had shifted only after the grip loosened. How effort had been replaced with contact, how control had given way to cooperation. There was no guarantee that every problem worked that way. Life wasn't a series of jars waiting to be opened with the right trick. Some situations were genuinely hard. Some choices carried real consequences. Acceptance didn't erase that. What it did erase was the extra suffering added by force. The extra layer of tension that comes from insisting reality be different before you're willing to meet it. The person picked up the jar again more out of habit than need, and then set it back down. There was nothing left to do with it. It had already served its purpose. The kitchen light was turned off, leaving only the faint glow from the hallway. Shadows stretched and softened. The apartment felt larger now, not because it had changed, but because the mind wasn't crowding it with demands. Moving into the living room, the person sat on the couch and let the body settle into the cushions. The posture was different from earlier in the evening, less rigid, more supported, as if the furniture was allowed to help now. The decision remained undecided, and that was okay. There was a subtle trust beginning to form, not in a specific outcome, but in the process itself. Trust that clarity didn't need to be forced. Trust that understanding could emerge without being wrestled into place. Trust that waiting wasn't the same as failing. The night continued to unfold without asking permission. A car passed outside. Someone upstairs walked across their apartment. The world carried on unaffected by whether one person had figured things out or not. That too was part of the lesson, though it didn't arrive as a lesson. It arrived as perspective. The world didn't need to be controlled in order to be lived in. Peace didn't come from managing every detail. It came from managing the reaction to what couldn't be managed at all. Acceptance, it turned out, wasn't a master key because it opened every door. It was a master key because it unlocked the hand that was gripping too tightly. With that, the body sank deeper into the couch. The breath slowed. The day finally began to loosen its hold. The decision would come when it came. And until then, nothing else needed to be opened. The laundromat was nearly empty. Two machines hummed along the back wall, their metal doors spinning slowly, rhythm steady and unhurried. A vending machine glowed in the corner, offering snacks no one seemed interested in. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting everything in the same pale wash. They sat on a hard plastic chair, laundry basket at their feet, phone resting loosely in their hand. It was late enough that no one expected conversation. People came here to wait to pass time, to let machines do work they didn't want to do themselves. No one asked questions. No one noticed much. They glanced at their phone again, not because there was anything new, but because habit pulled their thumb downward. Another scroll, another image, another life laid out in a clean frame. Someone announcing a promotion, someone smiling in a new city, someone else posting a caption about finally feeling like themselves. Each image landed quietly, but together they built a familiar weight. Everyone else is moving forward. The thought came without drama. It didn't shout. It didn't accuse. It just settled in heavy and convincing, like a fact that didn't need to be questioned. They locked the phone and slipped it into their pocket, feeling a brief sense of relief followed quickly by discomfort. Without the screen, there was nothing to distract from the feeling underneath. The dryers continued their slow rotation. A loose coin rattled inside one of the machines, tapping metal in a steady, uneven pattern. It sounded almost like a reminder, something small, out of place, but persistent. They stood up and walked to one of the washers, pressing their face close to the glass. Clothes tumbled through cloudy watercolors, blending together for a moment before separating again. Socks, shirts, a towel. Ordinary things, indistinguishable in motion. When the cycle ended, they opened the door and reached inside. Warmth met their hands, along with the faint smell of detergent. They pulled out a shirt, then another, stacking them carefully in the basket. As they worked, they noticed their hands. One thumb had a small scar near the joint, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. A thin white line left behind from years ago. They couldn't even remember how it happened anymore. It had become part of the landscape of their skin. They turned their hands slightly, watching the lines shift as their fingers moved. No two looked exactly the same. The ridges curved and split in patterns that felt deliberate, though they knew they weren't. Fingerprints. They had learned once in school that no two were identical, not in any meaningful way. Even among billions of people, each person carried something that had never been repeated and never would be. Standing there holding damp fabric, the thought felt strange. They had spent so much time measuring themselves against others, matching timelines, comparing achievements, wondering why their path looked slower, messier, less certain. It rarely occurred to them to question the comparison itself. You don't expect one fingerprint to match another. You don't call it a failure when it doesn't. The idea hovered, not quite landing yet. They moved to a folding table and began laying clothes flat, smoothing out wrinkles with the side of their hand. The table was cool, its surface marked with scratches and faint stains from years of use. Countless people had stood here, folding their own lives into neat stacks before carrying them back out into the world. They folded slowly, deliberately, a sleeve tucked in, a corner aligned. Each movement simple, repetitive, calming. Their mind drifted back to the feeling they'd had earlier, that sense of being behind. It had followed them for months now, showing up in quiet moments like this, not as panic, but as a dull, constant pressure. I should be further along. I should know what I'm doing by now. Everyone else seems to have figured it out. They paused, hands resting on a folded shirt. What if the reason it feels impossible to catch up is because there's no one to catch up to? The question didn't bring immediate comfort. It felt unfamiliar, almost unsettling. Letting go of comparison meant letting go of the map they'd been using, even if that map had never really worked for them. They picked up another piece of clothing, this time noticing the small differences. The way fabric wore thin in some places. The way seams held despite strain. Each item carried signs of its own use, its own history. No two shirts had aged the same way, even if they'd been bought together. The dryers beeped softly one by one, signaling their cycles had ended. A man in a hoodie entered the laundromat, nodded without looking up, and loaded his clothes into a machine. The space adjusted to his presence, then settled again. They stacked the last folded item and sat back down, hands resting on their knees. Their fingers left faint prints on the smooth plastic of the chair, not visible for long. just a slight smudge that caught the light, then disappeared. Most of the time they felt invisible, like nothing about them stood out, like they were blending into the background of their own life. But fingerprints didn't announce themselves. They were there whether anyone noticed or not. They existed without needing approval. They waited as the machines cooled the rhythm of the room steady and predictable. The weight in their chest hadn't vanished, but it had shifted. It felt less like proof of failure and more like a habit, something learned, not something true. They reached for their phone again, then stopped. Let it stay in their pocket. They looked at their hands once more. The lines were still there, unchanged, quiet, and for the first time in a while, that felt like something solid to stand on. They finished folding and slid the last stack into the laundry basket. The basket felt heavier now, not just with clothes, but with the quiet satisfaction of something completed without rush. They carried it to the empty chair and sat down again. The plastic creaked softly under their weight. The dryers were still warm, giving off a low hum that filled the room without demanding attention. They rested their hands on the basket, fingers spread slightly, and noticed the faint impressions they left behind on the smooth lid. Not clear enough to study, not permanent. Just a brief mark of contact. It made them think about how often they'd tried to leave stronger impressions elsewhere. Trying to be louder, trying to be clearer, trying to be more impressive, more certain, more something. As if being unmistakable was the same thing as being valuable. They had spent years believing that if their life didn't look recognizable, if it didn't fit into familiar shapes and timelines, then it must be wrong. Too slow, too late, too different. But fingerprints were different by design. They weren't meant to line up. They weren't meant to be compared side by side and judged for consistency. Their value wasn't in how closely they matched, but in the fact that they never did. The thought settled slowly. What if my path isn't delayed, just distinct? The idea didn't come with a rush of confidence. It didn't erase doubt or suddenly make everything feel clear, but it softened something. It loosened the grip of that constant internal measuring stick. They looked around the laundromat again. Different loads, different fabrics, different people passing through at different times of night, carrying different weights. No one here was ahead or behind. They were all just here, waiting for the machines to finish, trusting the process enough to sit still. They thought about moments in their life that hadn't made sense at the time. Detours that felt unnecessary. Pauses that felt embarrassing. Choices that didn't translate well when explained to others. Those moments hadn't been wasted. They had shaped the lines, added texture, created depth in places no one else could replicate. Just like the small scar on their thumb. Just like the ridges that bent and split in patterns no one had chosen, but only they carried. They flexed their fingers slowly, feeling the joints move, the skin stretch and settle back into place. The body knew itself in ways the mind often forgot. A dryer clicked off its door, unlocking with a soft metallic sound. They stood, lifted the basket, and moved toward the exit. The door chimed gently as they pushed it open, letting in a breath of cool night air. Outside, the street was quiet. A single streetlight flickered, then steadied. The world felt open in a way it hadn't earlier. Not because anything had changed, but because they weren't trying so hard to match it. They walked to their car and set the basket in the trunk. Before closing it, they paused, hands resting on the edge, feeling the chill of the metal. They didn't need to know exactly where they were headed next. They didn't need a clean narrative or a polished explanation. They didn't need proof that their life made sense to anyone else. Their value wasn't waiting at the end of a comparison. It was already present, pressed quietly into everything they touched. Like a fingerprint, not loud, not identical, but unmistakably their own. They closed the trunk and got into the car. As they drove away, the laundromat lights faded in the rearview mirror, replaced by the steady flow of the road ahead. The lines on their hands stayed with them, unchanged, unrushed. Enough. It didn't feel like a crisis. It felt quieter than that. More like something slowly dimming without making a scene. The kind of change that doesn't announce itself, but you notice it anyway. The way you notice a room getting darker before you reach for a lamp. The evening was calm. A porch light glowed softly outside, not bright enough to light the yard, just enough to mark the edge of the house. The air was warm, but cooling, the kind that carries the smell of grass and pavement after a long day. A small candle sat on the table. It had been lit earlier, almost out of habit. Not for ritual, not for comfort, just because it felt right at the time. Now the flame was lower. It leaned to one side, flickered when the air shifted, then straightened again. Each movement felt fragile, like it might be the last. Watching it brought up an unexpected tightness in the chest. There was a familiarity to that feeling. It wasn't really about the candle. It was about the sense that something was ending. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just slowly losing strength. For a while, the flame was ignored. Attention drifted elsewhere. To the quiet street, to distant sounds of people moving inside their homes, to the feeling of having given a lot to something that no longer gave much back. Eventually, the eyes returned to the candle. The flame was smaller now. Still alive, but barely. Wax pooled around the base, glossy and uneven, as if it had already accepted what was coming. The instinct was immediate. Fix it. There was a match nearby, another candle too. It would be easy to add more wax, more fuel, more light. Easy to intervene to keep it going the way it had been before. But the hand didn't move. Something hesitated. Watching the flame struggle brought up memories that weren't attached to words. A job that used to feel meaningful. A role that once made sense. A version of life that had burned brightly for a long time, until one day it didn't. Fear crept in quietly. If this goes out, what's left? What replaces it? The flame dipped again, nearly disappearing, then caught itself. That tiny recovery stirred hope. Maybe it could last a little longer. Maybe it just needed help. But hope felt tired. There was a realization forming, slow and uncomfortable. keeping something alive past its natural rhythm doesn't always save it. Sometimes it only stretches the ending. The flame flickered sharply, reacting to a small gust of air. The body reacted too, a subtle lean forward, a readiness to protect. And then it happened. The flame thinned, wavered, and went out. No sound, no drama, just a thin thread of smoke rising into the dim air, curling slowly, as if unsure where to go next. The chest tightened, not with panic, with something closer to grief. The table looked different without the flame. The porch felt darker, emptier. The absence was immediate and undeniable. This was the part fear always focused on. The moment after something ends. The gap where light used to be. The mind rushed in quickly. You should have done something. You waited too long. Now it's gone. But beneath the noise, the body noticed something else. The warmth from the candle hadn't disappeared all at once. The wax was still warm to the touch. The air still carried a trace of smoke. The flame was gone, but its presence lingered. Sitting there, it became clear how often fear confuses ending with failure. As if something fading means it was handled wrong. As if letting something end naturally is the same as giving up. But the candle hadn't been abandoned. It had been watched, allowed to be what it was until it wasn't anymore. The darkness didn't feel dangerous. It felt unfamiliar. And unfamiliar things always look larger before the eyes adjust. The porch light hummed softly. Night sounds continued indifferent to the small ending that had just taken place. Life hadn't paused to mourn the flame. Still, there was a weight in the chest, a sense of standing at the edge of something new, without knowing what it might become. The match stayed where it was, unlit. The decision not to relight wasn't brave, it wasn't symbolic. It was simply honest. Whatever was meant to come next hadn't shown itself yet. For now there was just the smoke thinning into nothing, the table cooling, and the quiet understanding that some things don't end, so something else can begin immediately. Sometimes they end so there can be space. And that space, though uncomfortable, was not empty in the way fear described it. Later, the absence of the flame became more noticeable than the flame ever had been. The porch felt wider. The table looked barer. Shadows settled into places they hadn't been allowed to before. At first, the darkness felt like loss, like something important had slipped away without permission. But after a while, the eyes adjusted. Details that had been washed out by the small circle of light began to appear. The grain of the wood on the table, the soft glow from the house behind the glass, the slow movement of clouds passing in front of the moon. Nothing rushed in to replace the flame, and somehow that felt right. Fear often insists that endings must be followed immediately by beginnings. That if one thing fades, another must ignite at once, or else everything falls apart. But sitting there, it became clear that transitions don't always work that way. Sometimes there is a pause. The body noticed its own state in that pause. The shoulders were lower now, the breath deeper. The constant effort to keep something alive had quietly stopped. There was relief in that, even if it came wrapped in sadness. The warmth from the candle was gone, but the body wasn't cold. The night air moved gently across skin. The chair still held weight. Support hadn't vanished just because one source of light had. This felt important. So many fears are built around the idea that if something ends, everything else collapses with it. That identity, purpose, or meaning are tied to a single flame. But life doesn't organize itself so narrowly. Light shows up in different forms. Heat travels. Energy moves. The flame hadn't been destroyed. It had completed its role. That thought didn't bring celebration. It brought steadiness. Inside the house, another room was lit. A lamp left on by habit. Through the window, its glow reached the porch, faint, but enough to soften the edges of things. Not all light announces itself. Sitting there longer, it became easier to feel how tired the effort of holding on had been. How much energy had gone into preventing an ending that was already underway. How often fear mistakes exhaustion for loyalty. Letting the flame go hadn't required courage, it had required trust. Trust that life doesn't depend on one source. Trust that what fades makes room without asking permission. Trust that renewal doesn't always look like replacement. Later, when the candle was picked up to be cleared away, the wax had hardened into uneven shapes. Small ridges, gentle curves. Evidence of heat that had moved and cooled in its own time. Nothing about it looked wasted. The match was still there too, unused, available, not urgent. That too felt right. There was no promise that another flame would be lit tomorrow. No plan for what would take its place. The future stayed open, undefined, and that openness no longer felt threatening. It felt spacious. Fear had been certain that darkness meant danger, that without constant light, something bad would happen. But the darkness had turned out to be just another condition. Temporary, neutral, allowing rest. Inside, getting ready for bed, the body moved more slowly than usual. Less driven, less tense. The day didn't need to be reviewed. The ending didn't need to be justified. Some things end not because they failed, but because they finished. The night held that truth easily. And as sleep arrived, there was a quiet sense that whatever was meant to burn next would do so when the time was right. Not forced, not rushed, not rescued from ending. Until then, it was enough to sit in the dark eyes, adjusted, breathing steady, trusting that nothing essential had been lost, only transformed. Anger doesn't always need a target. Sometimes it just needs a place to bounce. That night, the room was quiet enough to hear the low hum of electricity in the walls. A single lamp was on. The rest of the apartment stayed dim. Outside, the city moved at a distance, reduced to muffled sound and light. The phone lay in one hand, screen glowing softly. A message had been read earlier, not sent to this person directly. Just something seen in passing. A comment, a post. A few careless words stacked together and released into the world. It wasn't personal, and yet it felt personal. The words had a sharpness to them, a tone that suggested judgment, superiority, a casual cruelty disguised as honesty. Anger rose quickly, not slowly this time. It felt immediate, reflexive. The thumb hovered over the screen, already forming a response. The mind knew exactly what to say. It had sentences ready, clear, cutting, clever in the way that feels satisfying later in the shower. This wasn't about fixing anything. It was about answering. About not letting something stand uncontested. The room stayed silent. The phone buzzed faintly with other notifications. None of them mattered. The urge to respond felt clean, almost virtuous. If I don't say something, this kind of talk just keeps spreading. Anger is good at borrowing moral language. The comment was read again, then again. Each time it seemed worse, more intentional, more ignorant. The mind began to fill in the person behind the words, their tone, their habits, their character. A whole person was built out of a few lines of text. The thumb began to move. Words appeared, then disappeared. A draft took shape. It was sharp but reasonable, firm but not insulting. The kind of response that could be defended if needed. The chest felt tight. The breath shallow. The body leaned slightly forward, as if already entering an argument. Then something else became noticeable. The room was amplifying the anger. Every thought bounced back louder than it arrived. The quiet made the words heavier. The isolation gave the mind too much space to echo itself. It felt like standing in a cave and shouting insults, only to have them return stronger, harsher, multiplied. That image landed. An echo chamber doesn't create sound. It just repeats it. The anger hadn't come from the room, but the room was giving it nowhere to go except back. The thumb stopped moving. The draft stayed unsent. The phone was set down on the table. Face up this time. The light felt brighter than before. It became clear how easily the anger had been fed. A sentence had entered the mind, and the mind had decided to become its amplifier. What had been irritation was turning into identity. This is who I am. This is what I stand against. That's how anger recruits. It asks you to become its voice. The lamp buzzed faintly. The air conditioner clicked on. The ordinary sounds of the room reasserted themselves. The anger didn't disappear, but it paused. There was a realization then, uncomfortable but precise. Responding wouldn't stop the words from existing. It would only add another voice to the cavern. The mind resisted. Silence equals agreement. But silence doesn't always mean approval. Sometimes it means refusing to become a surface for reflection. The phone was picked up again. The draft was still there. Reread once. It sounded different now. Less strong, more performative. Like something written to be echoed, not heard. The words were deleted. Not because they weren't justified, but because repeating them would only keep them alive. The anger settled into something else. Not calm, not peace, just restraint. The room felt larger again, less charged. The echoes softened. The original comment still existed somewhere out there, unanswered, uncorrected. But it wasn't bouncing around in this room anymore. And for the first time since reading it, the anger wasn't multiplying. The phone stayed on the table longer than expected. Not out of discipline, out of a strange loss of interest. The anger that had felt sharp a few minutes ago now felt repetitive, like a sound that had already been heard too many times. The room was still quiet, but it no longer felt like a cave. The echoes had softened. Ordinary sounds returned to the foreground, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint traffic outside a neighbor's footsteps overhead. The mind tried again. It brought the comment back, framed a different response this time. Kinder, maybe, or more explanatory. Something that would add context, something reasonable. But the body reacted the same way. A subtle tightening, a familiar forward lean. The sense of entering a space where nothing ever really lands. That was the pattern. Any response, no matter the tone, pulled the mind back into the same chamber, the same loop, the same amplification. It became clear that the issue wasn't whether the response was right or wrong. It was what responding did to the one doing it. Anger wants an audience. If it can't find one, it'll make one inside your own head. Standing up, the body moved toward the window. The city lights were scattered uneven. Some windows lit, others dark. So many lives continuing completely untouched by the sentence that had felt so urgent earlier. The comment had already moved on, buried under newer posts, newer opinions, newer outrage. But inside this room, it had been given a microphone. That realization wasn't comforting. It was clarifying. The power of words isn't just in what they say. It's in how long we let them echo. There was a memory of past arguments years ago where sharp words had been exchanged, each one justified, each one returned with interest. No one had walked away feeling understood, only louder. Those moments hadn't failed because the points were wrong. They had failed because the space couldn't hold them without distortion. Echo chambers don't discriminate. They amplify kindness and cruelty alike. Whatever you throw in comes back, altered, stronger, less true. The phone was picked up again, not to respond, just to turn it off. The screen went dark. It felt quieter immediately, not peaceful, just less stimulated, less reactive. Anger doesn't disappear when ignored, but it does lose its momentum when it's not rehearsed. The thought arose. There's a difference between speaking and sounding off. Speaking aims to be heard. Sounding off aims to release pressure. Echo chambers reward the second and punish the first. That didn't mean silence forever. It didn't mean never naming harm. It just meant choosing the right spaces, the right moments, the right tone. Not every room needs to be used. The body returned to the chair. The lamp cast the same soft light as before. Nothing dramatic had changed, but something important had not happened. The anger hadn't been fed. It hadn't been given a surface to bounce off of. It hadn't multiplied. Instead, it had been contained. There was a subtle relief in that. Not the relief of being right, the relief of not being pulled. The comment would exist tomorrow, and the day after, and then disappear into the noise like everything else. What mattered more was the choice made tonight to not become a chamber for words that didn't deserve to live rent-free inside. The room felt neutral now, just a room again. The echo was gone, and that was enough. The book was thicker than expected. Not heavy in a dramatic way, just solid. The kind of book that promises a lot simply by existing. It sat on the desk with a clean cover, crisp pages, and a title that hinted at answers. Answers about how things unfold, how people find their way, how stories eventually make sense. The person picked it up, flipped a few pages, then closed it again. There was a familiar feeling in the chest. A quiet pressure. Not excitement, not dread. Something in between. The feeling that comes when you stand at the beginning of something and immediately start worrying about the end. The desk lamp cast a soft circle of light. Outside, the day was winding down, but inside, the room felt suspended, like time had slowed just enough to notice what was usually skipped over. The chair creaked slightly as the person leaned back, fingers resting on the edge of the book. The mind had already jumped ahead. Will this be worth it? What if I don't understand it? What if I start and never finish? What if the ending disappoints me? The questions came fast, stacking on top of each other, before the first page had even been read. It was as if the mind needed to know the entire arc before allowing the story to begin. This wasn't really about the book. It was about the way the mind treated beginnings. Every new job, every new relationship, every small shift or decision. The same pattern appeared standing at chapter 1, while mentally sprinting toward the final pages, measuring worth before experience, judging outcomes before taking the first step. The person noticed how the body responded to that pattern. Shoulders subtly tensed, breath shortened. The hands held the book more tightly than necessary, as if gripping it might somehow guarantee a good ending. The pages stayed quiet. Books are patient that way. They don't rush you. They don't explain themselves in advance. They simply wait to be read one page at a time. The person opened the book again, this time slower. The first page was simple. No grand reveal. Just an opening line, unassuming, almost ordinary. It didn't try to hook or impress. It just began. The mind reacted immediately. This is slow. Is this going anywhere? Maybe this isn't the right book. The urge to skip ahead was strong, to flip to the middle, to peek at the last chapter, to see where all this was headed before investing any attention. The person's thumb slid to the edge of the pages, ready to fan them forward. And then it stopped. Not because of discipline, not because of resolve, just because something felt tired. Tired of always jumping ahead. Tired of treating the present moment like a waiting room for something better. The thumb relaxed. The pages stayed where they were. There was a realization, quiet and unforced worrying about the ending didn't actually prepare you for it. It only pulled you away from where you were now. The body settled back into the chair. The lamp hummed faintly. The room held its stillness. The first page was read again, more slowly this time. The words landed differently when they weren't being rushed. Details emerged. Small textures, a tone, a rhythm. Nothing dramatic, but something steady. The mind still wandered. It thought about tomorrow, about whether this book would end up half-finished on a shelf like so many others, about whether starting was a mistake. Those thoughts were noticed, but not chased. They hovered, then drifted like background noise. The person turned the page. There was no surge of confidence, no sudden certainty that this was the right choice, just a small action completed. One page read, one page turned. It felt strangely satisfying, not because of achievement, but because of presence. The book hadn't asked for commitment to the ending. It hadn't demanded promises about finishing. It only asked for attention right now. The person read a few more lines, then a few more. Time passed without being tracked. The desk lamp grew warmer as the room darkened slightly. The mind still tried to jump ahead now and then. It offered worries dressed as practical concerns. But each time the eyes returned to the page in front of them. This was new. Not perfect, not permanent, but new. For once, the future wasn't in charge of the present. The person closed the book again after a while, not because it was finished, but because that was enough for tonight. The cover felt familiar now, less intimidating. The thickness no longer felt like a challenge. It felt like possibility. The book was set gently back on the desk. The ending was still unknown. And for the first time, that didn't feel like a problem. The book stayed on the desk after it was closed, resting where the light from the lamp touched its cover. It no longer felt like a task waiting to be completed. It felt like something that could be returned to without pressure. The person leaned back in the chair and let their eyes move away from the page. The room came back into focus. The quiet corners, the soft shadows, the hum of the lamp. The body noticed how much tension had drained out of the shoulders without being asked. There was a subtle relief in stopping without finishing. Not everything needed to be carried to its conclusion in one sitting. Not every beginning required a full commitment to the ending. Sometimes starting was enough. Sometimes staying with the first chapter was the whole practice. The mind, of course, didn't disappear. It returned with familiar concerns. What if you never finish? What if this is another thing you leave incomplete? The questions carried a tone of accusation, like unfinished things said something permanent about who you were. The person recognized that voice. It wasn't new. It had shown up in many forms over the years, around projects, relationships, plans, and goals. It measured worth by outcomes. It treated the final chapter as the only one that mattered. But sitting there now with the book closed and the room quiet, that belief felt thinner than it used to. Life, after all, wasn't a single story with one neat ending. It was many chapters, some finished, some paused, some never fully written. Meaning didn't come only from how things ended. It came from how they were lived while they were happening. The person picked the book up again, not to read, but to feel its weight. It felt different now, less heavy, less loaded with expectation. Just paper and ink waiting patiently. There was an unexpected tenderness in that patience. The mind had spent so much time worrying about the last pages of things, about how careers would turn out, how relationships would end, how choices would look in hindsight. That worry had always felt like responsibility, like maturity. But maybe it was something else. Maybe it was a refusal to be where you actually are. Thinking about the ending pulls attention out of the present. It turns today into a rehearsal instead of a lived moment. It makes chapter 1 feel like an obstacle instead of a beginning. The person set the book back down and stood up, stretching slowly. The chair creaked softly. The body felt grounded, not rushed. Outside the window, the sky had darkened further. Lights flicked on in neighboring buildings. Evening had arrived without asking whether anyone felt ready for it. The person moved through the room doing small things, straightening a stack of papers, rinsing a mug in the sink, turning off the lamp. Each action felt simple, unburdened by the need to lead somewhere else. The book remained unread beyond its opening pages, and that was okay. There would be time, or maybe there wouldn't. Either way, the value of the moment wasn't dependent on how the story ended. There was a quiet shift happening deeper than the book itself. A shift in how beginnings were approached. Less like tests to pass, more like invitations to step into what's here now. The mind still had habits. It would likely jump ahead again tomorrow. It would still worry about outcomes, about whether things would work out, about how the story should go. But now there was another option available. When the urge to flip to the last chapter appeared, it could be noticed and gently set aside. When anxiety about the ending arose, attention could return to the sentence in front of you, to the page you're actually on. Chapter 1 was enough. The person paused at the desk one last time before leaving the room, hand resting briefly on the book's cover. There was no promise made to finish it, no deadline set. Just a quiet acknowledgement that the story would unfold at its own pace. The ending could wait. Tonight it was enough to have read a few pages. Enough to have stayed with the beginning without rushing past it. Enough to trust that the story didn't need to be controlled to be worth reading. The room darkened as the light was turned off. The book disappeared into shadow, still unread in so many places. And yet something important had already been read, not from the book, but from the moment itself. A simple understanding settled in. You don't have to live at the end of the story. You're allowed to be where you are, right here. They didn't remember when it started, not the moment exactly. Just the feeling of slowly adjusting themselves to fit. Lowering their voice in certain rooms, choosing words carefully, smiling at the right time, holding opinions loosely even when they felt strong inside. It wasn't a lie, it was adaptation. And for a long time, it felt like maturity. That evening, they were walking through their neighborhood as the light faded. Street lamps flickered on, one by one, casting soft pools of yellow on the sidewalk. Leaves crunched underfoot. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once, then went quiet again. They walked without headphones, hands tucked into their jacket pockets, letting the night sound be enough. The day had been full of small compromises. Nothing dramatic, no conflict worth naming. Just moments where they felt themselves hesitate before speaking, where they checked the room before responding, where they adjusted not because they were afraid, but because it felt easier. Easier to be agreeable, easier to be flexible, easier to be liked. By the time they got home, they often felt strangely tired, even on days when they hadn't done much. The exhaustion didn't come from effort. It came from restraint. from holding parts of themselves back without noticing. As they walked, they passed a small park tucked between two streets. The lights were dimmer there, shadows stretching across the grass. A bird stirred in a tree, wings fluttering briefly before settling again. The sound caught their attention. It was soft, quick, instinctive. They stopped for a moment and looked up, though they couldn't see much through the branches. Just movement. Just the sense of something alive and alert responding to the night without hesitation. It made something tighten in their chest. They remembered a time when they moved like that. Not recklessly, just honestly. When choices came from a clear internal yes or no, instead of a calculation. Somewhere along the way, they had learned to check themselves first. Will this make things awkward? Is this too much? Should I hold back a little? Those questions had become second nature. Protective, sensible, but also heavy. They resumed walking, steps slow and even. The rhythm of their movement matched their breathing, steady and calm. The street ahead curved, slightly disappearing behind a row of houses. They thought about how often freedom is misunderstood. People imagine it as escape, as leaving everything behind, as doing whatever you want without consequence. That kind of freedom had never appealed to them. What they missed was quieter. The freedom to respond without rehearsing. The freedom to say no without guilt. The freedom to say yes without explaining. The freedom to be aligned. They reached a corner where the sidewalk widened. A bench sat under a tree, empty. They paused there, resting one foot on the curb, feeling the cool air move across their face. The truth was, they weren't trapped by anyone else. No one had asked them to disappear. No one had demanded they shrink. They had done it themselves, slowly, out of habit. Out of a desire to keep things smooth. Out of care. Care can be a beautiful thing. But when it's not balanced, it can turn into a cage. They leaned against the tree and closed their eyes briefly. The bark was rough against their shoulder, solid, real. A thought surfaced not as a challenge, but as a gentle curiosity. What if being myself is enough, even when it's inconvenient? The idea didn't feel rebellious. It felt relieving. They opened their eyes and noticed how quiet the park was now. The bird had gone still again. The street lamps hummed faintly. The night didn't demand performance. They took a deeper breath than before, chest expanding fully, then let it go without controlling the exhale. The body responded immediately, shoulders lowering just a fraction. It wasn't freedom as a grand declaration. It was freedom as a release. They pushed off the tree and continued walking, posture a little looser. Now steps a little less careful. Nothing visible had changed. Anyone watching would see the same person walking home. But inside, something had stretched its wings, not to fly away, just to breathe. They didn't suddenly change who they were. They didn't start speaking louder or saying everything that came to mind. They didn't make bold declarations or redraw the shape of their life overnight. What changed was smaller than that. As they walked the rest of the way home, they noticed how often they'd been holding their breath without realizing it. In conversations, in decisions, in moments where they waited for permission that never actually came. They let their breath move freely now, in and out, matching the pace of their steps. The body responded right away, as if it had been waiting for that signal. At the next intersection, a car passed slowly, headlights sweeping across the sidewalk. For a second, their shadow stretched long in front of them, then fell back into place behind. The image lingered. They had spent so much time trying to stay within certain outlines, certain expectations, certain versions of who they should be, depending on the room they were in. But shadows change with the light. They don't mean something is wrong. They just mean you're still here. They reached their front door and paused before going inside. The house was dark, quiet, familiar. A place where they didn't need to perform, or at least where they were learning not to. Inside, they set their keys down and leaned against the counter, feeling the cool surface under their palms. The day loosened its hold a little more. They thought about how often they'd mistaken safety for freedom. Safety had meant staying agreeable, staying predictable, staying small enough not to disrupt the balance. It had worked in a way. It had kept things smooth. But it had also kept them separate from themselves. Freedom, they were realizing, wasn't about pushing against anyone. It wasn't about rejecting connection or choosing solitude over belonging. It was about alignment. About letting the inside and the outside match, even when that felt slightly uncomfortable. Even when it meant allowing a pause instead of filling the space. Allowing a no instead of another yes. They sat down on the couch and rested their head back, eyes closing for a moment. The quiet wrapped around them, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a neighbor's TV through the wall. Ordinary sounds, ordinary life. They placed a hand on their chest and felt the steady beat beneath it. That rhythm hadn't changed based on anyone else's approval. It hadn't sped up to impress. It hadn't slowed down to fit in. It just kept going. There was a kind of happiness in that realization. Not the bright celebratory kind, but the steady kind. The kind that comes from no longer fighting yourself. They didn't need to be everyone's version of easy. They didn't need to be endlessly adaptable. They didn't need to earn the right to take up space. Being themselves didn't mean being rigid or selfish. It meant being honest, responsive, alive in their own skin. Tomorrow there would be moments when they slipped back into old habits, when they softened their edges out of reflex, when they forgot. That didn't mean the wings were gone. It just meant they were still learning how to use them. They lay back and let the night settle, fully breathing, slow and even. Somewhere outside, something moved in the dark, unseen, unjudged, simply following its nature. They didn't need to fly away to be free. They only needed to stop folding themselves smaller than they were. And in that quiet decision made again and again in small moments, happiness found room to land. It didn't feel like a loss at first. It felt like a wrong turn. The kind that happens quietly without alarms or clear mistakes. One moment everything seems to be moving in the right direction. The next, something expected simply isn't there anymore. The drive had started normally. Late afternoon light traffic moving slowly but steadily, the familiar stretch of road that usually led straight through. The GPS was on, not because it was needed, but because it felt reassuring to see the line drawn clearly ahead. Then the notification appeared. Route unavailable. Detour ahead. The screen adjusted instantly, redrawing lines offering alternatives that felt longer and less certain. The main route, the one that made sense, was gone. The body reacted before the mind formed a thought. A tightening in the chest, a slight clench in the hands on the steering wheel. Not anger, not panic, just resistance. This wasn't part of the plan. Traffic slowed further. Brake lights stretched ahead like a warning. The road sign confirmed it. The bridge up ahead was closed. Construction, indefinite timeline. The bridge had always been there. Reliable, unquestioned. Seeing it closed felt strangely personal, as if something dependable had been taken away without explanation. The idea of having to go around brought up irritation, then something softer beneath it, uncertainty. The GPS suggested a side road. Narrower, less familiar. It added minutes to the drive, maybe more. The mind immediately calculated the inconvenience, the wasted time, the disruption. Fear slipped in quietly. What if this detour leads nowhere? What if it makes things worse? The instinct was to wait, to pull over, to check for updates, to see if the bridge might reopen sooner than expected. Waiting felt safer than choosing a route that hadn't been tested. But cars behind kept moving. The moment didn't allow for long hesitation. The turn signal clicked on. The wheel turned. The car left the main road and entered a quieter street lined with older houses and tall trees. The change was immediate. Fewer cars, less noise. A different rhythm altogether. At first, the unfamiliarity felt uncomfortable. The landmarks were gone. The mental map no longer applied. Every intersection required attention instead of autopilot. The body stayed tense, alert for signs of trouble. The mind watched closely, ready to label the choice a mistake. But nothing went wrong. The road held. The car moved forward. The world continued. As the drive went on, something subtle shifted. Without the pressure of the main route, the pace slowed naturally. The shoulders dropped a fraction. The breath deepened. The detour wasn't empty. It was just different. Sunlight filtered through the trees, creating moving patterns across the windshield. Houses passed by, each one quietly, lived in each one part of a world that didn't exist on the highway. The fear that had insisted this was a setback began to lose its urgency. The bridge being closed hadn't stopped the journey. It had simply changed its shape. That realization didn't arrive as comfort. It arrived as surprise. How often does fear assume that the shortest path is the only valid one? That efficiency equals correctness. That deviation means failure. The broken bridge hadn't been a judgment. It hadn't been a punishment. It was just a condition. Eventually, the GPS adjusted again, guiding the car back toward a larger road. The estimated arrival time had shifted, but not drastically. Life hadn't collapsed because one structure was unavailable. The detour merged back into movement. there was still a sense of loss. The original route had been easier, familiar, predictable. But something else had been gained too, even if it couldn't be named yet. The body noticed less urgency now, less need to force arrival. The bridge remained closed somewhere behind, unused, out of reach. And maybe that was okay. For now the road ahead existed. It might be longer, it might be less direct, but it was still a road. Later, the broken bridge showed up again, even without the car. It appeared in smaller moments, in plans that didn't line up the way they were supposed to, in expectations that quietly fell apart without anyone to blame, in that familiar pause when something dependable suddenly wasn't available anymore. Fear recognized the pattern immediately. This wasn't the route. It brought back the same tension as before, the same urge to stop to wait to see if things might return to how they were. Because going back felt easier than continuing forward without a clear map. But there was another memory now too. The side road, the trees, the quiet stretch that hadn't existed in the original plan. That memory softened the reaction. Not every detour announces itself with signs and cones. Some show up as closed doors, canceled options, shifts that leave you standing still longer than expected. The mind labels them all the same way: interruption. But interruption doesn't always mean obstruction. Sometimes it means redirection. Sitting quietly later that evening, the body noticed how much effort goes into maintaining a single idea of progress. How tightly plans are held, not because they're perfect, but because they're familiar. The bridge felt safe because it had been crossed so many times before. Its absence had triggered fear, not because the destination was gone, but because the method was. That felt important. Fear often disguises itself as loyalty to the plan. It insists that changing course means abandoning intention, that staying true requires staying the same. But the detour hadn't erased the destination. It had only asked for flexibility. The body remembered how attention had sharpened on the side road, how presence had increased once autopilot ended, how movement had become more conscious, more alive. Maybe the bridge breaking wasn't a failure of structure. Maybe it was an invitation to wake up. The idea didn't demand agreement. It simply existed as another way of seeing what had happened. Plans are built on assumptions. Roads stay open. Bridges remain intact. Conditions don't shift unexpectedly. When those assumptions break, fear rushes in to fill the gap, warning of loss and delay. But delay isn't always a setback. Sometimes it's a buffer. A pause that prevents something worse. A slower pace that allows adjustment. A longer path that teaches endurance. The detour had asked for patience. It had also offered something unexpected, a sense of agency. Choosing the unfamiliar route had required trust in the moment, not in the map. That trust didn't feel dramatic. It felt practical. You turn, you drive, you respond. Life rarely asks for certainty. It asks for participation. The broken bridge hadn't demanded a new identity or a grand decision. It had only asked for a willingness to keep moving without guarantees. That willingness lingered now, even off the road. When another small plan fell through, a meeting rescheduled, a timeline adjusted. The body noticed the reaction earlier than usual. The tightening, the resistance, and then the release. There were other roads. There always were. They might not be visible right away. They might require slowing down, paying closer attention, letting go of efficiency for a while. But they existed. The bridge remained broken somewhere out of sight. Construction crews would fix it eventually, or they wouldn't. Either way, the world had already adapted. The journey continued, not in spite of the detour, but through it. That felt like the quiet lesson hidden in the delay. When the direct path disappears, it doesn't mean you've lost your way. It means you're being asked to find it differently, and finding it differently doesn't make it less real. It just makes it new. The body settled into rest that night, without needing the map to resolve itself. The road ahead didn't have to be known yet. It only had to be walked or driven one stretch at a time. The bridge being broken no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a reminder. Sometimes the fastest way forward is the way that teaches you how to keep going when the old way is no longer available. And that quietly was enough. Wherever you are tonight, I'm grateful you chose to spend this quiet time here. If these stories help you rest, you're welcome to subscribe and return whenever you need a gentle place to land. And now, you don't need to do anything more. Let the night hold what you can't carry. And if sleep comes, let it come.